I was but naked in a kiddie pool wearing nothing but a cowboy hat and sunglasses when I first saw it, the buzz of wings above, steady and slow like it knew exactly what it was doing. The drone hovered, paused, and tilted its little eye right at me like it was disappointed in my life choices. And in that instant I knew two things. 1. That drone was not here for wildlife photography, and 2. Karen from the HOA was about to start the most ridiculous war of her life. Now let me back up before you think I lost it entirely. I live just outside a gated community called Eagle Ridge Estates, a name that screams, we take ourselves way too seriously. My property borders theirs, but technically I'm not part of the HOA. I have my own patch of land, 5 glorious acres of peace, solitude, and the freedom to wear whatever, or nothing, on hot summer afternoons. I'd spent years building that peace. Solar panels, an automated garden, a chili pepper greenhouse with strains I crossbred myself. It was my little kingdom. Then the drone came. At first, I thought it was a kid's toy. No big deal. I waved at it, flipped it the universal signal of buzz off, and went back to enjoying my adult-sized juice pouch. But the next day, it was back. This time circling my greenhouse like it had stock in jalapenos. It zoomed low over my compost bins, hovered weirdly near my kitchen window, then zipped off as fast as it came. Suspicious, sure, but I chalked it up to curious neighbors with new gadget. We've all been there. But then came the envelope. Taped, yes, taped, to my mailbox was a typed note on floral-printed HOA stationery that read, Dear resident, aerial footage has revealed several violations of community aesthetic codes including, but not limited to, unapproved lawn ornamentation, visible compost bins, and shirtless loitering. Loitering. On my own land. I don't even live in their community. That's when I knew this wasn't curiosity. It was surveillance. I paid a visit to the community office, where I was greeted by the ever-chipper, ever-judgmental Karen Wexler. She had the haircut. You know the one. Layers that could slice through drywall and a glare that could curdle milk. She called herself president of the board, though her badge looked like it came from a party supply store. I asked her, politely at first, why their drones were flying over my land. She smiled like she just smelled something unpleasant. Oh, the security drone is just ensuring that adjacent properties aren't a threat to neighborhood harmony. Nothing personal, she said, before casually mentioning that if I wanted to appeal anything, I'd need to submit a request form and attend their next HOA meeting, which required prior approval and a residency waiver since I technically wasn't a member. Oh, and she added, the footage has already been archived in case we need it for future community safety reviews. Let me translate that. She'd been filming me. Recording. Keeping files. For safety. I don't know what scared me more, that she thought she had the right or that she genuinely believed she did. By the end of the week, 3 drones were flying regular loops over my property. I'd startle awake to buzzing at dawn, and once, during a late-night bathroom trip, I caught one peeking through the bathroom window like some robot pervert. My friend Eli, a former Air Force radar technician who now spends most of his time fixing lawnmowers and winning bar bets, came over for beers. I told him what was happening, and he nearly choked on his pretzel. You're being droned by the HOA, he said. Buddy, that's not just invasive. That's practically an airspace violation. That was the moment it clicked. We didn't need to file complaints. We didn't need to play by Karen's rulebook. We needed to speak the only language HOA dictators understood: absolute, undeniable humiliation. And ideally, it should involve water balloons. It started with a prototype. I had an old leaf blower motor, some leftover PVC from my sprinkler overhaul, and a retired popcorn machine that I'd gutted after an unfortunate cheese incident. Eli and I built the base over the weekend. We calibrated pressure using apples and a parking sign I stole from my own driveway after the HOA tried to fine me for its angle. By the time we were done, we had a water balloon cannon capable of launching with terrifying precision. It could fire frozen water balloons over 100 feet, but we'd tone it down. Mostly. As we built, the drones flew closer, bolder, almost daring us. One even hovered above as I test-fired a round of flour-filled balloons at an old barbecue grill. The balloon hit with a satisfying splat, covering it in powder like a ghost had passed out on it. I caught the drone tilting as if studying. That thing had attitude. Karen, of course, wasn't done. That week, I found a laminated, final warning stuck to my tomato trellis. The violations were now upgraded to community adjacency offenses, a phrase that means nothing but sounds intimidating if you say it in a boardroom. It also threatened fines of up to $300 a day if I didn't remove unsightly structures, aka my perfectly normal greenhouse and homemade windmill. So I responded the way any reasonable man would. I placed a scarecrow in the field wearing a neon sign that said, "Smile for the drones," and installed a speaker that played dramatic court trial music every time they flew over. But the real piece de resistance was the moment I finally fired the balloon. One hot Saturday afternoon, the drone returned, flying low, too low, maybe to get a better angle at the chili rose. I armed the cannon. I tracked the target. I breathed in the scent of wet latex and vengeance. And then, boom. Direct hit. The water balloon exploded on contact, soaking the drone's undercarriage and shorting something vital. It wobbled, buzzed, and spun wildly before spiraling down into Karen's beloved koi pond on the other side of the fence. I watched the splash from my deck chair and took a slow sip from my juice pouch. I thought it was over. But little did I know that splash was just the beginning. Because Karen doesn't lose gracefully. No, Karen calls the cops. Karen calls emergency HOA meetings. Karen declares war. And buddy, I had no idea how deep this drone rabbit hole went, or how high the stakes would fly. The day after the drone went down in Karen's koi pond, I woke up to a level of silence that felt unnatural. No buzzing, no aerial peeping, not even the usual rustling of wind through the pine trees. It was eerie, like nature itself was holding its breath. I knew that wasn't a good sign. Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat, especially not when it came via a high-velocity water balloon. And sure enough, an hour later, I received a knock at the gate from a man wearing khakis, mirrored sunglasses, and a badge that simply said, HOA Compliance. He handed me a folder marked Incident Report and informed me that I was now under official investigation for aerial misconduct and drone destruction of community property. I asked him what law gave the HOA jurisdiction over airspace, and he just smiled like a mall cop with a taser and walked away. I didn't even have time to laugh before I opened the file and saw the photograph, an aerial shot of me, pointing a garden hose at the sky, surrounded by empty water balloon shrapnel like a madman defending his castle. That was the moment I knew we had to escalate. Not recklessly, not with malice, but with art. Tactical absurdity, if you will. Eli came over with donuts and a smirk that said he'd been waiting for this day his whole life. We set up shop in my garage, transforming it from your average lawnmower graveyard into a full-blown war lab. On the table, blueprints. On the shelves, ammo. In the corner, an old satellite dish we'd named Big Bertha. The idea was simple: improve accuracy, increase range, and diversify payload. We weren't just launching water balloons anymore. We were developing packages. Some filled with colored dye, some with glitter, and a few with chili extract from my most potent peppers. Non-lethal, non-toxic, but extremely unpleasant. Think Skunk Works meets prank war. While we worked, the drone activity didn't stop, it shifted. We noticed new models flying overhead, quieter, smaller, with weird-looking domes on their underside. Karen had upgraded. These weren't hobby drones anymore, they had thermal capabilities. We tested it ourselves one night by placing a few heated bricks on my lawn and watching from inside with binoculars. Sure enough, the drone locked on like it was targeting enemy heat signatures. Who uses military-grade surveillance for lawn violations? Karen Wexler, apparently. But even as her tech escalated, so did her paranoia. A few residents from Eagle Ridge started reaching out to me anonymously. One sent me a message that simply read, "She's watching us too. Through our windows. It's not just you." Another, a nervous teenager who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in months, handed me a flash drive in the parking lot of the local Dollar General. On it, drone footage stitched together from various properties. Kids playing in backyards, a woman practicing yoga in her living room, an elderly man feeding his cats while singing off-key. Karen had been stockpiling footage. For what purpose, no one knew. But I was willing to bet it wasn't for a neighborhood scrapbook. That intel changed everything. We weren't just defending my property now, we were defending basic privacy. So we built the balloon cannon version 2.0. This one had a rotating turret, an auto-aim system based on my old karaoke machine's voice tracking sensor, and a loading mechanism made from a repurposed toaster conveyor. It looked ridiculous. It also worked like a dream. We called it the Gusher. Eli wanted to name it after a famous tank from World War II, but we settled on something more colorful. Literally. Our test rounds exploded in blue, green, and neon orange mist, which had the added bonus of making the drone fragments easier to find when we scored a hit. We installed the launcher on my roof, connected it to a motion sensor, and set it to manual override only, just in case things got too crazy. I even taught my dog, Waffles, to bark when he heard a drone buzz, an early warning system powered by peanut butter treat. By Thursday we were ready, and right on schedule, a drone returned. This one flew lower, slower, maybe trying to bait us. But I had patience. I waited until it paused midair, likely transmitting its findings back to Karen HQ. Then, with a press of the big red button labeled Yeehaw, I launched a neon green balloon filled with biodegradable glitter and a splash of eucalyptus oil. Direct hit. The drone spun once, made a wheezing noise, and fell into the wooded area behind Karen's home. We celebrated with grilled cheese and victory root beer, but we knew the response was coming. And boy did it. The next morning, several signs were posted on my property line, giant laminated ones that read "Designated Threat Zone" and "HOA Surveillance in Progress. Do not interfere." One of them had a very dramatic eagle silhouette. It was so absurd, I half expected a fog machine to kick in. But it didn't stop there. That afternoon, 3 HOA board members showed up with clipboards and measuring wheels, claiming they were surveying the boundary for future fencing plans. I pointed out that they were standing on my private land. They disagreed. So I brought out my deeds, maps, and my old college friend, who also happened to be a licensed land surveyor. When the board members saw the actual coordinates, their smiles faded. They had, indeed, crossed into my territory. But instead of apologizing, they just mumbled about interpretive boundaries and walked off. That's when I realized they weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to harass me into submission. Unfortunately for them, I have the stubbornness of a cactus and the free time of a retired raccoon wrangler. The final straw of the week came when a fourth drone showed up with an actual speaker attached. I was watering my garden when it flew overhead and blared, in Karen's unmistakable voice, "You are in violation of HOA Ordinance 14B, cease and desist all hostilities immediately or risk legal action." That was it. The line had been crossed. Karen had weaponized her own voice like a budget Bond villain, and I wasn't going to stand for it. I called Eli. We met at sundown. I brought the chili extract. He brought the high-density balloons. Together, we filled a dozen rounds, each one loaded with just enough capsaicin to make a drone think twice before flying again. We didn't even have to fire them. The next morning, as we sat drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, we noticed something different. The sky was clear. The air was quiet. No buzzing. No blaring. No drones. Just birds, the sound of the sprinkler ticking in the garden, and Waffles chasing his tail like a lunatic. We looked at each other, nodded, and said nothing. Because we both knew, this wasn't the end. This was the calm before the Karen. For a blissful 36 hours it was quiet. Almost too quiet. No drones, no HOA patrols, no Karen declarations broadcast from airborne speakers. I dared to believe the glitter-filled water balloon assault had driven them into hiding. Maybe Karen had finally accepted that she couldn't claim dominion over airspace that wasn't hers. Maybe she realized she'd overplayed her hand. Or maybe, and this was more likely, she was just gearing up for a counterstrike so dramatic it would make soap opera villains seem subtle. That answer arrived sooner than I expected, in the form of a garden explosion, an HOA tribunal, and a piece of footage that would set the entire neighborhood on fire, metaphorically and almost literally. It started with the koi pond, or more accurately, what was left of it. Eli and I were sipping lemonade on my porch when we heard the most satisfying splash-crash-pop combo I'd ever heard. We didn't even flinch, we knew what it meant. Drone down. But within minutes, sirens wailed. Not police. Not fire. HOA emergency response. Yes, that's a thing now, apparently. 3 golf carts sped down the main lane of Eagle Ridge Estates, each with a red flashing light rigged to the roof, carrying board members in matching windbreakers and expressions of false urgency. Karen was at the front like some sort of general, her arms flailing, screaming about a violent act against aquatic life. She marched straight to the edge of her property, pointed a long, perfectly manicured nail in my direction, and shouted, "That drone carried a precious gift from my niece, a custom camera. Do you understand what you've done? You've traumatized Koi." I nearly choked on my lemonade. Eli whispered, "Is she seriously filing emotional distress on behalf of fish?" The answer was yes. She was. Later that afternoon, I received an official summons. Not from a court of law. Oh no, this came stamped with the HOA crest, a gold-plated pinecone over crossed pruning shears, and declared that I was to appear before the HOA tribunal for reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and dishonorable conduct unbecoming of a neighboring landholder. I didn't know whether to laugh or pack a bag. I went with laughing until I couldn't breathe, then agreed to attend. Not because I took it seriously, but because I wanted to see what insanity looked like in person. The tribunal was held on a freshly mowed section of the HOA community lawn. 3 plastic folding tables made up the dais, flanked by hanging ferns and 2 solar-powered torches for ambience. Karen sat center, wearing a white pantsuit like she was officiating a royal wedding. To her left was Roger, her husband and the community developer, who had the blank stare of a man who stopped resisting years ago. To her right was Cheryl, HOA vice president, who looked more interested in her nail polish than in the proceedings. Around them sat a dozen residents, most of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. But then came the twist. Before they even got to their charges, I pulled out a flash drive. Eli had it set up. We'd spent the last 2 nights combing through the anonymous files we'd been given, the ones from nervous residents and the mysterious Dollar General drop. The footage was damning. Not just the usual backyard peeping, but drone recordings that were clearly saved and cataloged by date and address. Some had voice note. Karen's voice, narrating things like window open, subject in pajamas, clutter visible, recommend warning letter. Others were worse. At least one file captured a teen changing through a window. We blurred everything before showing it, but the implication was clear. I plugged the drive into the projector and stood back. The crowd gasped. Even Roger sat up straighter, suddenly sweating through his collar. Karen stood up, waving her arms and shouting about fabrications and deep fakes, but the HOA residents had seen enough. One elderly couple got up and walked away in disgust. Cheryl, looking very much like she regretted her whole life, leaned in to whisper something to Karen, who slapped her hand away like a toddler refusing vegetables. Then Eli delivered the cherry on top. He stepped forward, holding up a second USB drive. This one contained an audio recording, dated weeks ago, of Karen and Roger in what sounded like a planning meeting. "Roger, you think anyone's gonna care if we lease the drone data? It's just yards and bushes." Karen, "We'll package it as neighborhood engagement metrics." Besides, if they're not hiding anything, they shouldn't mind. Roger, what about the guy on the other side of the fence? The chilly guy. Karen, oh, he's a nuisance. We'll find something to pin on him eventually. The room was silent. You could hear the battery in the solar torch hum. Karen, suddenly pale, said nothing. Cheryl stood up, took off her badge, and dropped it on the plastic table with a thud so satisfying it echoed. Then she turned to the crowd and said, I think it's time we had a new vote. That's when everything unraveled. Over the next 20 minutes, residents took turns listing complaints they'd kept bottled up for years. How Karen had rejected lawn designs, forbidden kids from using chalk on driveways, fined someone for wind chimes that were too whimsical. One man admitted he stopped walking his dog because he felt watched. A woman cried about being accused of hoarding because she kept flower pots on her porch. What started as a trial for me turned into a full-blown reckoning for Karen. The HOA rules that were once her armor suddenly became the blades that cut her down. And just when I thought it couldn't get better, a police cruiser pulled up. Not for me. For Roger. Turns out that real estate analytics firm? It had a pending lawsuit for violating residential privacy laws. Roger had been selling location data, unfiltered drone GPS, and the company didn't know it was being gathered illegally. Someone had tipped off authorities. My bet? Cheryl. Roger was escorted off the lawn in handcuffs. Karen screamed something about civil war and neighborhood loyalty, but no one moved. No one defended her. The mighty HOA throne she'd built with fear and fines cracked beneath her. And I just sat back in a lawn chair, sipping another juice pouch, and watching the spectacle with all the satisfaction of a man who had just won a very bizarre, very wet war. But as the sun set and Karen stormed off into her overpriced hybrid SUV, I couldn't help but feel like something was still brewing. Because people like Karen don't fade quietly. They regroup. They retaliate. And if I knew anything about her, it was that she had one last card to play. I figured after the tribunal disaster, Karen would finally crawl back into whatever lavender-scented cave she came from and stay there. She had been publicly humiliated, her husband had been hauled off in handcuffs, and her iron grip on the neighborhood had snapped like a twig under a bulldozer. But no. Karen didn't go into hiding, she went nuclear. I should have known that exposing her wouldn't be enough. People like her don't know how to take a loss. They don't retreat, they reload. And she did, with lawyers, paperwork, and something that buzzed louder and flew higher than anything we'd seen before. The first sign was a certified letter, delivered by a man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of harassment, public defamation, and willful interference with official HOA operations. According to the letter, Karen claimed I had committed acts of psychological warfare, using water balloons. I framed it and hung it in my bathroom. But what really caught my attention wasn't the legal threat, it was the fine print at the bottom that read, pending approval for temporary restraining perimeter around HOA-registered zones. She was trying to zone me out of my own land. That same day, a new drone appeared. Bigger. Meaner. Shaped like a spider with wings and loud enough to rattle the siding on my shed. It didn't hover or survey, it patrolled. It circled in defined loops around Karen's house, and occasionally drifted toward my side of the fence like it was challenging me to do something. It had flashing red lights, a speaker, and a license number taped to the underbelly. She had registered it with the city. It was, technically, a security drone, but in practice, it was intimidation wrapped in a plastic shell. Eli showed up that evening with a cooler full of root beer and a notebook he called the Drone Death Ledger. He had been working on improvements to the Gusher, our beloved water balloon launcher, but now we needed upgrade. We needed an anti-air system that could handle these new monstrosities. He proposed building a twin-barrel version with a rotating base, heat-seeking sensors, and a wider ammo array. I agreed, on the condition that we give it a ridiculous name. We settled on Double Trouble, Vengeance Edition. But while we prepped for aerial warfare, something unexpected happened. A video. It popped up online, posted anonymously, of one of our balloon launches from a few days back. It showed a drone creeping across my greenhouse, then a balloon exploding in midair like a Technicolor firework. The caption read, "Balloon Justice, HOA Tyrant Gets Popped." Within hours it went viral. People loved it. Comments poured in from across the internet, some applauding the creativity, others offering engineering tips. A guy from Utah claimed to have built a glitter cannon in honor of the chili guy, which I assume was me. Then the press found out. A local news van showed up asking questions. Apparently, someone tipped them off that there was a surveillance rebellion happening at Eagle Ridge. I gave them my most neutral quote possible. "I believe everyone deserves privacy, chili, and the right to balloon-based defense." It aired on the 6 o'clock news. Karen's face must have turned a shade of red not found in nature. The next day, more signs popped up around the community. "This is a drone-free neighborhood. Except for HOA-authorized units." Residents were clearly getting fed up. Someone spray-painted over one of the signs with a cartoon balloon and the words, "Team Splash." Then came the unexpected ally. Cheryl, the former HOA vice president who had ditched Karen during the tribunal, reached out again. This time, she had company. A group of residents, maybe a dozen, met with me one evening under the cover of dusk. They brought lawn chairs, snacks, and grievances. Turns out they'd been suffering in silence for years. Karen had fined people for mailbox paint, Halloween decorations, and once even tried to ban inflatable pools because they lowered curb appeal. These folks were done being scared. Cheryl revealed that the HOA had a clause buried deep in its bylaws allowing for an emergency leadership vote if enough members signed a petition citing abuse of power. All they needed was 51% of the voting members. And they were close, real close. But Karen still had access to the community mailing list and was flooding inboxes with fear-mongering emails, tales of vandalism, dangerous vigilantes, and threats to suburban peace. Her new platform was all about reclaiming order from outside agitators. That agitator, of course, was me. Karen's next move was audacious even for her. An official eviction notice, served not to me, but to a neighbor who let their kids play with my dog. The reason? Unauthorized guest interactions. I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. It was clear Karen was trying to isolate me, make me look toxic. But it backfired. The neighbor went door to door with the eviction notice, showing people how absurd it had gotten. By the end of the week, a new chant had emerged at every HOA meeting. "Down with the drones." But Karen wasn't done. She launched a website. A full-on digital smear campaign, complete with manipulated footage of me allegedly trespassing and diagrams of balloon weaponry, presented like I was building WMDs. Eli nearly cried from laughing when he saw it. But it was working, at least partially. A few new residents, confused by all the chaos, began expressing concern. So we fought back the only way we knew how, with balloons, brains, and a little bit of good old-fashioned pageantry. Eli and I spent the weekend preparing for the big event. We called it the Splash Rally. We set up a legal demonstration zone just outside the HOA fence line, invited the local media, and gave a presentation on drone ethics and neighborhood privacy rights. We wore capes made from old bedsheets and handed out chili-themed balloons to the crowd. Cheryl spoke about rebuilding the HOA from the ground up. The residents cheered. And then, just as the sun dipped low, the biggest drone we'd ever seen appeared on the horizon. It was Karen's final move. A massive drone, easily 6 feet across, flying a banner that read, "HOA reclaims this land." The speaker crackled. Her voice, dramatic and booming, echoed over the field. "Cease your unlawful assembly or face the consequences." And just like that, everyone turned to me. Eli nodded. I pressed the button. Double trouble fired with perfect precision. 2 balloons, one filled with glitter and dye, the other with chili oil and biodegradable soap, soared through the air like justice itself. They struck the drone dead center. It shook, sparked, and spun wildly before crashing nose first into the HOA clubhouse, right through the roof. And just like that, the rally turned into a celebration. Residents cheered, kids danced in the leftover mist, and someone even started grilling Karen. She vanished into her house and didn't come back out. The HOA clubhouse was now a glitter-coated monument to resistance. But we all knew one thing. This was the climax, not the end. Karen still had her title. But not for long. The final vote was coming. And if she thought drones and lawsuits were her ace, she hadn't seen what we had planned next. For a woman who had just crash-landed a 6-foot drone into her own HOA clubhouse, Karen was remarkably quiet. Too quiet. After the splash rally, and the spectacular midair takedown that left her security drone smoking in the roof tiles, everyone expected her to lash out. Maybe another round of cease and desists, maybe she'd try to declare the whole event a rogue insurgency. But nothing came. Not the next day, not the day after that. The clubhouse remained shut, the roof now half covered in glitter and melted plastic, and Karen's curtains stayed drawn. For someone who once published a newsletter called The Weekly Watch, her sudden silence was almost suspicious. Naturally, we didn't trust it for a second. The residents of Eagle Ridge, on the other hand, weren't waiting around to see what Karen would cook up next. The petition to remove her from office was now a tidal wave. Cheryl and her ragtag coalition of former rule victims had mobilized like pros. They even printed campaign flyers, actual glossy ones, with slogans like, "Take back the block" and "No more HOA abuse." Someone made t-shirts. Someone else designed a lawn sign with a balloon hitting a drone and the words, "Let freedom splash." It felt less like a revolt and more like a parade with a vendetta. Meanwhile, Eli and I began field testing a new type of balloon, filled with glitter, essential oils, and a tiny speaker that played elevator music when it burst. Not because we needed to, but because we could. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. You don't go from HOA queen to reclusive shut-in overnight without plotting something. The calm was too deliberate. The silence had weight. And I was proven right one afternoon when a man in a suit showed up at my gate with a briefcase and a smile that made my spine itch. He introduced himself as Philip Castle, a private arbitration specialist, and handed me an invitation. Not a subpoena, not a complaint, an invitation. Karen wanted to resolve our disagreements civilly, through a neutral third-party mediator. Eli read the fine print and snorted. "She's not settling," he said. "She's staging her comeback." And she was. The mediation meeting took place inside the very same HOA clubhouse she had accidentally bombed. The roof was patched with tarp, the interior smelled faintly of burnt plastic and lilac air freshener, and yet there she stood, immaculate, smug, and somehow even more determined. She wore all white again, like she was attending a wedding between spite and control. Philip the arbitrator welcomed us like we were at a brunch mixer and asked us to leave emotion at the door. Karen immediately launched into a 10-minute monologue about moral decay, airborne terrorism, and how my dog barked in a tone that was clearly trained to intimidate. I let her finish. Then I handed over a folder. Inside were all the photos I had taken of the drone flights, the notes from residents, and a signed statement from Roger himself, who was now facing charges and had flipped on Karen to save his own skin. The statement was short and devastating. Karen had ordered all surveillance operations, had misused HOA funds, and had planned to sell resident footage under the guise of lawn optimization data. It was notarized. Karen didn't say a word. Philip blinked twice, looked at her, then at me, and announced the mediation may have reached a natural conclusion. The next morning, Karen's house had a for sale sign in the yard. Apparently, that was the final straw. Whether it was the statement, the vote coming up, or the realization that she could no longer rule through intimidation and inflated bylaws, Karen folded. Residents said she packed overnight. No goodbyes, no garage sale, no passive-aggressive farewell post in the community forum. Just gone. Like a glitch fixed in a software update. And with that, Eagle Ridge Estates began its long overdue recovery. Cheryl was elected HOA president in a landslide. Her first act was to suspend all drone surveillance, permanently dismantle the HOA Compliance Patrol program, and open the budget books to the public. What she found was enough to make a forensic accountant faint. Karen had been ordering office upgrades that included a luxury espresso machine, spa subscriptions, and a $2,000 retreat to a leadership vineyard that didn't actually exist. Cheryl made copies, forwarded them to the authorities, and hosted an open-air town hall where people could vent. One man cried. Another brought cookies. The air was thick with catharsis. As for me, I became something of a neighborhood legend. Kids started showing up at my place asking if they could see the launcher. One boy brought a drawing of me riding a giant balloon, waving a chili pepper like a sword. I had to start locking my gate not to keep people out, but to stop them from sneaking in to take selfies next to the Gusher. I didn't mind. For once, it was good attention. Harmless. Joyful. Nobody was trying to find me for compost bins or complain that my tomatoes were too visible from the street. Even Waffles seemed happier. The final surprise came a week later, at dusk, when a black SUV with government plates pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit too neat to be local. He introduced himself as a representative from a federal agency with interest in creative, non-lethal deterrent systems. Apparently, my water balloon guidance software had been flagged by a defense analyst who saw the viral video. He offered me a consulting opportunity. "We're always looking for outside-the-box thinking," he said, handing me a card with a seal I didn't recognize. Eli laughed so hard he dropped his root beer. I told the guy I'd think about it. I wasn't in a rush. Life had become peaceful again. My greenhouse was thriving, my skies were clear, and I could finally enjoy a day without having to duck from mechanical birds buzzing overhead. Still, part of me missed the rush, the battle, the high-stakes absurdity. But mostly I was glad it was over. The night Karen left, I stood in my yard with Eli, watching the stars. We didn't say much. Just listened to the wind, the crickets, the distant laughter of neighbors who no longer felt watched. I thought about how ridiculous everything had been, how serious it got, and how satisfying it was to fight back without becoming what we were fighting. I raised my last balloon of the season, painted gold, sealed with chili wax, useless but symbolic, and launched it high into the night sky. It arced perfectly, burst against the black, and glittered as it fell. Peace had returned. But the cannon stayed. Just in case.